Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Dutch Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Dutch Race Ratings, the series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. Also, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy it and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Sorry to jump in, but Taran from the future here. I figure I should just mention at the time of recording I haven't heard anything about the Sainz and overtaking under the yellow flags, so if something does come of that, just bear in mind when I'm talking about different positions and where everyone has finished the race. Otherwise though, let's get on with it. So getting into the result, and it is Max Verstappen who takes home another victory, his 10th of the season, after a crazy end to the race, too many safety cars in that one. Russell taking advantage of those safety cars for P2, putting on the soft tyres, and then Charles Leclerc rounding out the podium. Lewis Hamilton down in 4th place, bit of disappointment for him, kinda left out to dry on the medium tyres, we'll get into that later on. In behind him, Checo Perez, with Alonso best of the rest and Norris behind him. Carlos Sainz down in P8 after a penalty, demoting him from what would have been 5th place. All sorts of crazy stuff going on for the Spaniard in this one. And then finally Esteban Ocon and Lance Stroll rounding out the top 10. Getting into the race itself, and it was a fairly even start. You know, everyone generally held position. I think Russell went back one. I think maybe Ocon and the Aston Martins made up a couple. You had Magnussen going off on lap 2 as well, sending him to the back. From there, some early stops for the soft runners, all triggered by Pierre Gasly and everyone looking to go for the 2 stops, except for the Mercedes, who seemed to be on the 1-stop strategy, and it looked like it was going very well for them, setting up a good sort of Hamilton-Verstappen ending where Verstappen would come out behind and he'd have to overtake the Mercedes to get back into the lead. Before that though, Lewis would have to get past Perez in what was almost feeling a little bit like Abu Dhabi, with Checo trying to hold him up and Lewis trying to get through. And to boot, you had Sebastian Vettel just deciding to sit in the middle of all of that and not let anyone past him even though he was being lapped. Then as we got further into the race, what really started all the chaos at the end was the whole Yuki Tsunoda situation where he goes into the pits, feels that something isn't wrong, like a tyre loose maybe, so stops. The team then tell him no, it's absolutely fine, so he carries on, slowly goes back round to the pits, they change the tyres and do up his seatbelts a bit by the looks of things, send him back out and he stops 4 corners later. Brings out a VSC, which means Verstappen stops from the lead, Hamilton and Russell stop from behind, and a few more pit stops elsewhere, but it wasn't long before Bottas's Alfa Romeo packed in, as it tends to do, and the safety car for that meant that loads more people came into the pits, with basically everyone going onto soft tyres, except for Lewis Hamilton, who Mercedes left on the mediums, which meant that he went from P1 to P4 by the end of it all. But if there's a silver lining for the Silver Arrows, it's that this is the closest they've been to getting a win this year for sure, and I think that's a positive they probably have to take away. Then on to the ratings, and starting with you guys from the YouTube poll as always, and for this one you've given it a 7.2, which on the whole I think is a pretty fair rating. However, in my head I'm trying to work out how much is dependent on the actual racing and how much is just from the chaos at the end. And the words I would kind of use is the end was sort of chaos, but it wasn't actually that much action. Like when I think about it, Hamilton dropped back a bit, Sainz and Perez were kind of close, but on the whole there wasn't actually a ton of like overtakes coming from that final stint. Definitely did make it more chaotic and definitely probably better than what was going to be happen after the first VSC. For my rating though, I think I'm going to give it a 6.5, which is slightly lower, and it's because up until that point, there really wasn't too much going on. The strategy was definitely a good slow burner, you know, it was the 2-stopper versus the 1-stopper, but on the whole there really wasn't a ton of action, which I guess is to be expected from Zandvoort, but on the whole I still say it was a good race and I enjoyed watching it. Also, a point of consideration is if both Mercedes were on the soft tyres at the end, just imagine what that ending could have been like. Onto the teams, and starting with Alfa Romeo, and generally it's another disappointing one. 1 DNF, 1 car not in the points, not too great. For drivers, I'm going to start with Valtteri, who began fairly low down on the soft tyres, didn't really make too much progress early on, swapped to another set of softs and still wasn't really making progress, just generally running a couple of places behind his teammate. But then swapped onto the mediums and actually did start to move forward. You know, he was then ahead of his teammate, making progress on the Williams, until his car kind of died at the end in sort of very typical Alfa Romeo fashion for this year. So I think when it comes to a rating for Valtteri, it's probably going to be a 5.5. On the whole, he wasn't overly ahead or behind his teammate, the car wasn't particularly quick, and then he had the issues which weren't his fault at all. So I think when you look back, it's got to be considered just generally kind of average. Next up then Joe, who had a very similar strategy to his teammate, starting on the softs, going soft again, and then onto the mediums. Did start just ahead of his teammate and actually had a fairly good opening lap, he made up a place or two. But from there, just sort of settled in, didn't really do too much. He sort of got caught in that Tsunoda train that was there for quite a while. However, a little bit later on in the race, when he got the opportunity, he was really pushing up to the backs of the likes of Gasly, for example, but then got undercut from Bottas, from who was behind him at the time, and so when Bottas did retire, he was sat a few seconds behind his teammate. Also got a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. So when I look at his race, I think it just generally looks kind of mediocre, plus you consider he was just behind his teammate and got the penalty. I think rating-wise it's going to be a 5. I think pace-wise he wasn't bad, I think just in general it was sort of average, but then you add in the penalty, just a little bit below. Next up we have Haas, and no more points for them, and a car that in all honesty didn't really look to be enjoying the Zandvoort track too much. For drivers, I'll start with Magnussen, and honestly had his race undone very early on lap 2 when he went off into the gravel at turn 2, turn 3 I think it is, just on the inside of the bank corner. Did manage to carry on, which is good, however it sent him all the way to the back, and so for the rest of the race was just generally trying to claw his way back in a car that really wasn't too great, and just before the safety cars was about 5-6 seconds off of his teammate, which when you think about it isn't too bad. Did also see him making a bit of a mistake trying to overtake Latifi, just completely outbraking himself into turn 1. So a rating for Kevin, I think it's probably going to have to be a 4, because ultimately his race was completely undone by his own fault early on lap 2 and could just never really properly recover from there. Next up we have Mick, who actually started fairly high up in 8th place. He started on the mediums and did lose a place or two early on. However, his race kind of came undone when he stopped and had like an extra 8 seconds for his time just due to a slow stop. From there though, kind of like Magnussen, like he'd lost the places and was trying to make his way up the field. Did see some nice overtaking, some nice racing with him and Sebastian Vettel before he stopped again later on. After the safety car was on soft tyres but couldn't really make any inroads and ended up finishing 13th. So for a rating for Mick, I think it's going to be a 6. I think it's a fairly average drive, it's nothing too special, but he's not really made any mistakes in there, and his long pit stop is what's cost him a lot, and that's really not his fault. Next up Williams, and while no points, still a decent showing from Albon in what is most definitely the slowest car on the grid. And for the Williams drivers, I'll start with Alex Albon. So started in 15th on the medium tyres and generally was just running very, very well. Had quite a quiet race, didn't see too much of him, but looking back at the timings was always sort of in that sort of 12th to 14th kind of range. And actually at one point was up into P7, not net, but just generally running there, which shows how kind of high up he was. So for a rating for Albon, I think I'm going to have to go with a 7. It was a fairly quiet race, but in the end he's finished P12 with only one retirement from in front of him, and he's definitely held his own with those cars that are faster. So yeah, 7 sounds good to me. Then we get onto his teammate Latifi, and I'll keep this one pretty quick. He's started in last place, he's ran net last the entire race, and before the safety car at the end was around 25-26 seconds behind the cars in front of him, some of whom had made a whole extra pit stop. So for Latifi, ratings-wise, it's going to be a 2. He's not made any mistakes on his own, he's just been incredibly slow. Next up AlphaTauri, and while no more points for them, we did see one of the strangest incidents I've definitely seen in my time watching F1. For drivers, we'll start with Pierre Gasly, who started just outside the top 10, and that's where he ran pretty much the whole race actually. He boxed really early, sort of triggered all of the soft runners come in for their pit stops, but from there wasn't really making too much progress. Found himself behind Yuki at one point with both of them on the medium tyres, and while initially was right up behind him, then did start to drop back, and eventually the gap went from sort of like under a second to around about 4. He then came in for hard tyres and was making progress as others pitted from ahead of him, however still not any higher than around about 12th place. So ratings wise for Gasly, I think it's going to be a 5, it's either a 5, 5.5, just a fairly average drive, but I'm going to go at that 5 simply because he did look to be slightly slower than Tsunoda when they both had the same tyres. And then we get on to Yuki, who generally was having a sort of quiet race, maybe slow at points, there was definitely a DRS train kind of forming behind him, however generally ran in front of his teammate Gasly and as I mentioned did pull away just a little bit when they were on the same tyres. And then we get to his second pit stop, where he comes in, they change the tyres, and very quickly he's going slowly thinking that there's a problem with one of them, so he pulls over, stops, slightly undoes his seatbelts by the look of things, at which point the team say, no, you can carry on, so he goes back round, they change the tyres, send him back out again, and then stops 4 corners later, with it apparently being a differential issue that they didn't spot at first, which I won't lie, is just a weird one. Like, why would you bring a car in, say that there's nothing wrong with it, and then send it back out again only for it to stop straight away? Obviously, none of that is Yuki's fault, so it's not going to kill his rating or anything, and for that rating for Yuki, it's going to be a 6, just generally running ahead of his teammate, doing fairly alright. But yeah, that whole pit stop is one of the strangest moments I've seen in my time watching F1. Next up, Aston Martin, and they've picked up a point in this one, which is actually seeming like a more normal result for them, which is pretty good considering where they started the season. For drivers, I'll start with Seb Vettel, and he started fairly low down thanks to a poor qualifying, and made up a couple of places early on. I think it was 2 places in the first lap or 2, pitted quite early on off of his soft tyres following the likes of Gasly up ahead, had some nice battles with Mick Schumacher, a couple of times, but then eventually got overtaken by Mick. And then later on had the whole blue flag drama, where Hamilton passed Perez, Vettel came out the pits and just sat in front of them both for basically half a lap. And honestly, getting a 5-second penalty for that is very fair. There were multiple chances he could have pulled over and just seemingly didn't. So ratings-wise for Seb, I think it's actually going to be quite low. It's a 4.5. And another reason for that was there was a point when he was just behind Albon, but actually found himself dropping backwards and away from the Williams. Couple that with the penalty for blue flags, and I think it's a fair enough rating. Next up we have Stroll, and like Vettel, made up a place or 2 on the opening laps. That's pretty good. And for the rest of it was actually running in the top 10 for a lot of the time, sort of around P8, managing to keep the likes of Alonso and Ocon behind him for pretty much the whole race, and actually looking back on it, only really lost out thanks to the late safety cars and virtual safety cars, etc., which dropped him down to 10th. From there, he held on to that position and came away with a point. So getting into Stroll's rating, there's a lot of things to consider. Was he ahead of his teammate the whole race? Yep. Was he holding faster cars behind him the whole race? Yep. And did he lose those places not really through his own fault? Yep, to that as well. So rating-wise for Stroll, I think it's going to be a 7.5. It's between a 7.5 and an 8, somewhere around that range. But I think that 7.5 is still fair. Like, it's not an exceptional, incredible performance where he's up in like P5 or 6 or anything, but still a really solid, really good drive, generally all round. Next up we have McLaren, and while they picked up a couple of points this week, they've still lost out in their battle with Alpine and moved just a little further behind in 5th place. For drivers, I'll start with Ricciardo and just what was a pretty disastrous race in general. Started fairly far back after a not great qualifying, and then just found himself there pretty much the entire time. Whenever I was looking at the timings, he always seemed to be sort of within a second or close to a second of the car ahead, but could never get past. I'm talking about the likes of Sebastian Vettel in front of him. The team tried to go with undercut, but they didn't work, and he just found himself towards the back of the pack the entire race. When you consider where his teammate Lando was, who I'll get onto in a second, it's really not great. Plus, couldn't really take advantage of anything with a safety car at the end. So rating-wise for Ricciardo, it's got to go down as a pretty bad one. I think it's going to be probably a 3. It's not like Latifi levels where he's a million miles off the back of everyone. He's still kind of there with the cars ahead, but couldn't get any moves done, couldn't get past people, and so far back off his teammate. Then on to Lando, who was one of the 6 cars that started on the mediums, sort of doing an alternate strategy. However, like the Mercedes, as you'll see at the front of the field, he pitted really early. I think it was on like lap 19, something along those lines, to go onto those hard tyres. And it did kind of work for him, because it meant that when everyone else pitted, he stayed ahead of the likes of Stroll and the Alpines behind him. And looking at the timings, just always had a sort of comfortable 3 seconds or so to those cars behind. However, come the safety cars at the end, moved on to soft tyres and was then in front of the Alpines, and found himself being overtaken by Alonso, so there's a little bit off just there. So rating-wise for Lando, I think pace-wise and position-wise it was really great. I think it's going to be a 7.5. It would be just a half mark, maybe a mark higher, but ultimately he has lost out to Alonso at the end, and those that are their direct competitors in the Constructors' Championship. Next up we have Alpine, and after not the best of qualifyings with them both out in Q2, they've recovered well to pull more points on McLaren. For drivers, I'll start with Ocon, started in P12 and made up about 3 places on the opening couple of laps, which put him up into 9th. At which point he found himself behind Lance Stroll and couldn't get past until all the safety car stuff at the end, so he spent most of his race kinda behind Stroll. Also lost out to his teammate Alonso when they all switched onto the hard tyres, with Alonso kind of getting the undercut on him, which I guess isn't his fault, that's the team's call as to who comes in when, but on the whole for Ocon I think it was a fairly solid race, but not overly special. So ratings-wise for Ocon, I think it's going to be a 6.5. He has started ahead of Alonso, finished behind him, not really challenged Stroll, but he's not been bad or anything and has made progress. So overall, I'd have to say it's good, but nothing special. On to Alonso then, and he actually didn't really make too much progress at the start, which meant that once it all kind of settled down, he found himself behind the likes of Tsunoda and Gasly with his teammate further up ahead. However, did get past both of those and made overtakes, which was something not too common throughout the race. And so, he's made progress when he's starting further back, which is pretty good. Did stop fairly early for his first set of hard tyres, going straight from the softs to the hards. But that did mean he was able to undercut his teammate Ocon, and eventually then overtake Lando later in the race because he was ahead of his teammate and had the opportunity to do so. So rating-wise for Alonso, I think I'm going to go with probably an 8. It's between a 7.5 and an 8. But looking back at it all, he's overtaken cars, overtaken his teammate, then overtaken Norris at the end, got past Stroll and all of that as well, and ended up finishing up in 6th place with the penalties to Sainz. So actually, I've got to say it's a pretty good drive. Next up, Ferrari, and I've got to say, coming into the weekend, I think everyone expected a lot more from them considering it's more of a high downforce track compared to the likes of, say, Spa or Monza. For drivers, I'll start with Leclerc as there's actually less to really go through. Obviously didn't manage to get the lead at turn 1, and then sort of kept behind Verstappen, maybe a second or two just behind, and then his tyres really dropped off before the end of his stint, and the gap went from sort of 2 seconds to around 5 seconds. And then we saw a very similar thing when they were both onto their medium tyres, where he sort of stayed in that gap but slowly dropped back, and then come the end of the stint was even further behind. And then factor in, while on those medium tyres, Verstappen made his way past the likes of Russell, was closing up to Hamilton, and then got back into the lead when Hamilton stopped. Whereas Leclerc never really looked like he was going to be catching up to the Mercedes cars. And then once Hamilton and Russell had pitted a little bit later on, we sort of heard over the radio from Leclerc and his engineer that they sort of knew that they were going to end up in 4th place if nothing happened. Fortunately though, something did happen and we had all of the drama later on, and the team swapped him onto the soft tyres, which was the right thing to do, and he took advantage and got past Hamilton. And it was pretty important that he did get past him as well, because we saw at the end of the race that the sort of softs and the mediums kind of evened out. So if he hadn't got past Lewis when he did, he probably isn't finishing in 3rd, so it's pretty good that he's managed to do that. Ratings-wise for Leclerc, I think I'm going to go with a 7.5. I think he definitely didn't have the pace to keep up with the likes of Verstappen, and didn't have the pace to make the 2-stop work versus the Mercedes. So up until the end, you're probably looking at a sort of 6.5, maybe 7, but then bumped up to a 7.5 just a little bit thanks to his opportunistic move at the end with Hamilton. And then we have his teammate Sainz, and it almost seemed like if something could go wrong, it would go wrong. I'll go through his race, and to start off with, definitely dropped back off Leclerc, definitely looked to be slower of the two Ferraris, dropping back sort of 4 or 5 seconds pretty quickly. Then we get to his pit stop, where he comes in, they call it pretty late, and there's only 3 tyres waiting for him. Binotto even said over the radio that it was a complete mess up on their part. That's nothing to do with Sainz, but that cost him so much time. Comes out into the mid-pack, I think it was behind Albon, and slowly has to make his way back up towards the leaders if he can. And then we get to his second stop, which is an unsafe release by the team. That's completely on the team, that's nothing to do with Sainz. However, something that is on him, and at the time I'm recording, as I should have mentioned earlier on, I haven't heard anything about this whole yellow flag overtaking incident, where he goes past Ocon under the yellow flags, and it looks like a pretty slam dunk yellow flags, why are you overtaking there? Again, I haven't heard anything at the time of recording. It may well be that he was just ahead, but even so, it's one of those ones where you probably don't need to be making the move and it's not worth the risk. So for a rating for Sainz, it is kind of tricky. However, I'm going to give him a 5, and the reasoning is as follows. First off, definitely didn't have the pace on Leclerc. However, all of the stuff to do with the pit stops, like the unsafe release and then not being a 3rd or 4th tyre even, that's not on him. However, you then have the yellow overtaking thing, which is a little bit all over the place. Did manage to get Perez at the end, but I think when you consider that Perez was on mediums, he was on softs, he should be getting that place, but with that 5-second penalty, it dropped him back to 8th. So I think on the whole for Sainz, it's not been the best of races, and even his stuff wasn't the best as well. Then we have Mercedes, and I'm kind of tempted to say with this one that it could be the first weekend where they haven't fully maximised on everything available when both cars have been running fine. Driver-wise, I think I'm going to start with Hamilton on this one. Gets away fairly okay, holds his 4th place into the first corner. From there, on the medium tyres, actually looks to have really good pace. He's steadily closing the gap to Sainz, keeping up the Ferrari ahead, there's no issues there. Sainz then moves out of the way to change tyres, and Hamilton actually finds himself in the lead once Verstappen pits later on. From there, just pumping in the lap times, keeping it consistent, very good on the whole, I didn't see any mistakes. Swaps to the hard tyres on that one-stop strategy that Mercedes are going for. Doesn't quite get past Perez at the first opportunity, but does so at the second, obviously then encounters Vettel coming out the pits as I've just mentioned, but on the whole was just running very solidly, very good pace the whole time. Then we get to the end of the race, and first off, Mercedes pit him for medium tyres under the virtual safety car, which to me I think makes sense. Verstappen stopped, they're not going to get the lead, may as well swap to better tyres. Then we have the safety car afterwards, and my take on this is, yes, the softs were definitely the better option, and as you'll see in a minute, we saw that George made the call for softs. However, it shouldn't be on the driver to have to call the best tyre. I think we can all look back in hindsight and say, yes, he should have put him onto the soft tyres, but that's not really Lewis's call to make. It should be on the team. Did have track position in first place, but lost it instantly, and I've got to say it wasn't a great restart. You know, you've given Verstappen a tow all through the banking and along the main straight. Then loses out to Russell, you know, a tiny bit of late moving for that defence, a little bit risky there, and then Leclerc gets past fairly easily with the DRS on the softer tyres. So I've got to say those last 3 places aren't really on him as much, because obviously the team has put him on the mediums. Rating wise for Hamilton, I think I'm going to go with an 8, maybe an 8.5, it's in that range. You know, before all of the stuff at the end, he's probably on like a 9, 9.5. However, I am sort of docking off half a mark to a mark, just because I think that restart was really poor, even with the worst tyres. He sort of had the worst possible restart in that case, but on the whole, it was still a really great drive, and for the first time this year, I think it's the case where we've gone, yep, he really could win this one. Then we get on to his teammate Russell, who actually lost a place on the opening lap. I think it was Norris that squeezed through. However, it was only on lap 4 that he managed to get back past. Was going for the one-stop strategy, which put him ahead of the likes of Perez and Sainz when they made their early stops. Then had Verstappen come up behind him, and I would have liked to have seen maybe a bit of a better defence, like Verstappen kind of got by fairly easily, it didn't really take too much. But then again, Verstappen had the quicker tyres, and he's Verstappen in a Red Bull, it's pretty hard to keep him behind. Comparing to Hamilton, pace-wise, it was actually fairly even, like whenever they were on the same tyres, you know, they had basically the same strategy, he wasn't really losing any time. Definitely wasn't gaining time, but basically kept the gap between sort of 3-4 seconds the whole time. And then later on was initially swapped onto mediums before making the call himself to go onto soft tyres, which proved to be crucial as it meant that he could go from 3rd to 2nd. I don't think he would have challenged for the win if he was ahead of Hamilton, like I'm still backing Verstappen in that one probably, but still, that call is what got him 2nd place, and we saw what happened to Hamilton moving backwards. Ratings-wise for George, I think it's probably going to be an 8.5. You know, pace-wise, he's been on Hamilton pretty much the whole time, managed to get past people like Perez, I think at one point when he needed to, and then to round it off, makes the call at the end for the soft tyres. And finally, we get to Red Bull, and it's another win for them, which they'll take. Their lead is absolutely huge, and on a track where they definitely weren't necessarily the outright quickest car, to come away with that is a really good result. For drivers, I'll start with Checo, and the start was okay, maintained position behind Hamilton and ahead of Russell. However, on his soft tyres compared to the Mercedes mediums, definitely seemed to be caught by George and wasn't really catching Lewis ahead. Then all the pit stops come round, obviously he gets past Sainz because of Ferrari messing up, and I was looking at the timings between him and Leclerc, and they stay at a really consistent 7-ish seconds for basically the whole race. Then later on played a crucial role in holding up Hamilton when Lewis was coming through, and Perez managed to keep him behind for a lap or two, which I think they said cost about 3 seconds or so to the Mercedes, helped a little bit by Vettel as well with that time, but still did a good job of defending as much as he could. Was also overtaken by Russell, who was at the better tyres that stage. Then later on you get to all the safety car stuff, and like the Mercedes cars he ends up on the mediums, which isn't great, which then allows Sainz to get through. However, the big standout for me in this race was when you compare to the likes of Verstappen or even Leclerc, Perez just wasn't with them, he just wasn't there. Rating wise for Checo, it's probably going to have to be a 6.5 when I consider that he was never really challenging anyone around him. The Mercedes were quicker on the mediums, he was behind Sainz had it not been for all the stops, and then Sainz got him at the end, and had it not been for the penalty for Carlos, Perez would have ended up 6th out of the 6 top cars. And then finally Verstappen, so he gets away well and gets out of DRS range from Leclerc fairly early on, and definitely had the pace over his Ferrari rival, was slowly pulling away and building that gap even more as the race went on. And I also think he had a really great middle stint on the medium tyres when he changed from the softs to the mediums, the first of a 2-stop strategy, because the gap to Hamilton behind that he needed for the pit stops was never like crazily small. It was always kind of a case of even if he pitted without a safety car, he'd come out sort of like 6 seconds behind. which with fresh tyres, I still would probably back Verstappen to take the win from there. I will say the initial VSE for the Tsunoda incident definitely helped Verstappen out. I think you have to say it obviously did, just based on the positioning on track. However, then Red Bull made all of the right calls when it came to the second sets of stops with the safety car for Bottas, and they put him on the soft tyres. Great restart, got Lewis as quickly as he could, and then went off and won by sort of 3-4 seconds to Russell behind. Ratings-wise for Verstappen, it's between an 8.5 and a 9. The sort of 9.5s, 10s are reserved for the absolutely incredible performances. But still, I think for Verstappen, it has to be a 9. He was the only car who was able to make that two-stop work in terms of the leaders and still going for the lead. Clearly had the pace over the Ferraris behind him, and honestly, I still think he would have won had it not been for all of the safety car stuff at the end. So yeah, 9 for Verstappen. So that rounds out the race ratings for the Dutch Grand Prix, and on the whole, I think it's a pretty even set. You've obviously got Verstappen at the top, Latifi at the bottom. But in general, I think it was sort of like a more even bag of performances. There weren't too many like crazy standout ones, and there weren't too many that were horrific either, other than Latifi. Then with the updated sort of standings, it's still Verstappen with a very commanding lead over now George Russell in second place, so he's jumped up 1. At the other end, Nicholas Latifi still at the bottom by quite a margin, and Daniel Ricciardo now has sole possession of effectively 19th place. But anyway, that is all for now. As mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed, and subscribe for more F1 content, along with leaving your thoughts, feedback, ratings and suggestions down in the comments below. But until next time, take care.